So as everyone knows, mixing metal can be fucking crazy and super intense. And when I joined my band with my buddy Eddie, and we decided to do kind of a Dimmu Borgir death metal thing, I knew it was going to be a challenge, trying to mix all of these elements with the orchestras, the bass guitar, the super crazy drums, the guitars and all of that. It was okay. I wasn't really happy with it though. And when I sent it to a mentor of mine, he said that, yeah, you got some problems, but it's definitely listenable. But nevertheless, it's a learning experience. And something that you guys should all take to heart is, when you're mixing your own stuff and releasing your own music, don't be afraid to just say fuck it and just release what you have and always move on to the next project with a better understanding of what to do. So ultimately, the strategy here is orchestral elements in metal need to complement and not compete. It's about enhancing the power of the guitars and drums and not overshadowing them. So I'm going to use a ton of EQ to carve out space for this. Some panning and some reverb will aid in this, but a lot of it's going to come down to EQ and cutting a lot of the low end in your mix to make room for the elements of the core band, which would be vocals, guitars, bass, and drums. So jumping right into it, let's go ahead and just listen to the mix that I got here. This is, again, my band's single, and we'll just play you a little bit so you guys can have an idea of what the orchestral elements are doing. In that particular chunk, the orchestra was in the forefront. It is the intro of the song, so I wanted it to explode out of your guys' speakers. And so that is what I'm going for. In other sections, I brought back the orchestra to make room for things. So let's check out first the brass section to see what I have going on. Now, with the sample libraries that I have chosen, I deliberately chose ones that don't have a lot of low end, knowing that I was going to be using more of the mid-range and high end for these particular tracks. Nevertheless, there is low end baked into the tracks. So on the brass section, I am cutting everything below about 60 hertz, so it's not in conflict with anything, as well as reducing some of the high end around 10K so that I can have that high end for my cymbal tracks. I am also boosting around 8K to get a little bit more air out of my brass section. But here's the also key move: because brass is a mid-range instrument, that it kind of acts as a low-end instrument, I didn't want that mid-range to interact with my guitars, so I decided to cut a little bit at 2.5K to make room for my rhythm guitars, and an additional 800 hertz is also being reduced for about 3 dB to make room for the lower end of the spectrum of the guitars. So let me go ahead and play you that brass section. That is with EQ. Let me go ahead and turn off the EQ and pay attention to how some of the body comes back, but it's a little bit more muddy. So you can definitely tell that while there may not be a lot of low end, there is still elements of low end in there that I would prefer not to be. So by reintroducing the EQ, I have cut out the elements that I don't need, and I have introduced elements that I do need, such as high end. All right, let's go ahead and check out the cellos here. So it was a very similar circumstance with the cellos versus the brass. I felt like they were a little too dark, so I introduced some high end at 8K. They were in conflict with my guitar tracks, so I reduced some of the mid-range at 2.5K as well as 800. And they also had some low end that I reduced around 90 hertz. I didn't need that to be in there. And I reduced the high end a little bit more than I would in the brass because those string sections were getting a little bit, how do I put this, piercing in a way that I didn't really particularly enjoy. So I was cutting everything above 8K to reduce some of those piercing frequencies. So let's go ahead and remove the EQ so you guys can hear all of that, which I just mentioned. Okay, that was without the EQ. Let's pop in the EQ now. All right, so that is pretty much how I would mix orchestral elements. When it comes to mixing orchestral elements, it's a game of two things: compromises and priorities. First, you're gonna have to decide which elements of the mix are your priorities, whether that's gonna be the core elements of a band, such as guitar, bass, drums, etc., or is it gonna be the orchestra? In Flesh God Apocalypse's example, I feel like they, in certain records, had the orchestra become the priority, while in subsequent records, they started to take a bit of a backseat, like on the album No. I felt like they kind of started going back to their roots, where the main elements of the band were starting to be brought back to the forefront, versus on the album King, where it was full-on orchestra all the time, and I had a really hard time hearing the guitars on that. With that said, let's go ahead and bypass our EQ processing, and I'm going to play you the mix without any processing on those brass and cello sections, and then I'm going to play you the mix with those sections and see how that cleans up a bit of mud in the mix. So as you can tell, it may sound like it's lower in volume, but ultimately what's happening here is a lot of that high-end boosting that I did to have them cut through the mix is now gone, so they're having trouble being heard in the mix. But what is being introduced, if you didn't notice, was a bit of mud, and it sounded like a little bit of a blanket was over the mix. Now, if I reintroduce the EQs, you should see that the mix should open up a little bit, sound a little bit less cluttered, and have the orchestral elements pop through a little bit more. So that's pretty much all there is to it. Orchestral elements can elevate your metal track to an epic level. Just remember to keep them in their lane, cut out any low end that you don't need, boost any high end or reduce any high end that you may need, and kind of just make sure that they fit in the puzzle piece of the core elements of the mix, which is going to be your bass, your drums, your guitar, and your vocals. So if you found this video helpful, give me a like, comment, and subscribe. And if you'd like for me to mix your music, shoot me an email at divinemotherstudios@gmail.com or check the comment links